Hello viewers, welcome back to my channel. In today's video, we are going to discuss the SDTM mapping specification creation for IE domain, which is one of the domain in the finding class. IE domain is one of the easiest domain in SDTM, but however, many programmers do a very basic fundamental mistake in creating the IE domain. It is a common misunderstanding that in IE domain, we capture the response to the inclusion-exclusion criteria for each subject, for each criteria which the subject has answered. This is a wrong understanding. So in this video, we will understand why and how we are going to create the IE domain. Right now, as per the SDTM IG, you can clearly see that they have given the intent of the domain is only to collect those criteria that causes the subject to be in violation of the inclusion exclusion criteria and not the response to each criteria. What does that mean is that if in a study there are 10 inclusion criteria, 10 exclusion criteria, and if a subject has passed or uh, has fulfilled all the inclusion criteria but has failed one exclusion criteria, that means out of the 10, the response to one exclusion criteria is yes, then that subject is considered as a screen failure. Now, if this subject is a screen failure, there can be two possibilities which can happen with this subject. The first thing is that since it's a screen failure subject, the subject will be enrolled out from the study. However, the second scenario is that either due to some mistake or the some sponsor has provided the waive off to include this screen failure subject in the study. If that is the case, then and only then this subject data will come in our IE dataset. And in that IE dataset also, out of the 10 inclusion criteria and 10 exclusion criteria, the questions which the subject has responded to, we will only have one entry in IE domain, and that will be for the exclusion criteria which the subject has failed. So if you see this IG, it is clearly mentioned in your assumptions as well that the in the IE domain, we captures the only the inclusion exclusion criteria exceptions per subject. All all the exclusion criteria that are violated, and that should be stored here. There is a specific note that this will be done only for the subjects for which either the sponsor has provided a waive off or the subject was admitted by mistake. So we are only capturing the data as the response to only the criteria that the subject did not meet and not all the criteria. So having understood this basic rule of SDTM, we will see how we can create the SDTM IE dataset mapping specification. So before we move on to that, let's see these annotated CRF form. So again, for my study, which I am being using for my other domains as well, I'm using the same study. So this is an open label studies, which is a dose escalation study. And in this study, I have a IE form where what is captured is that the first question is, did the subject meet all eligibility criteria? A response is yes or no, which is captured in your IEYN variable of the raw data set IE. Another information which is captured was the subject a previous screen failure? This is something which is we are already capturing as a subcall and not as a core variable of IE domain. The other core information which is captured on CRF form is regarding the criterias which the subject did not meet. So right now for exclusion criteria, the terminology will definitely be the inclusion criteria not met and exclusion criteria met, because if this, as per the definition also, it is clear that the subject should exclude meeting the exclusion criteria, and if the subject is meeting any exclusion criteria, that clarifies that this subject is in not in sync with the requirements of the study protocol. Similar is the case for the inclusion criteria, that to be included in the studies, the subject should meet the inclusion criteria. And if the subject is not meeting, then that subject can be categorized as the screen failure. So now in this CRF form, we are capturing the criteria IDs here for the inclusion as well as the exclusion. We have two different variables to capture that. For inclusion criteria ID, we have the variable ID, INCL ID, and for the exclusion criteria, we have EXCL ID. We can see the annotation that based on the response on these two questions, the IECAT is annotated. If there is criteria of inclusion exclusion criteria ID is answered, then the IECAT will be inclusion, and for the exclusion criteria ID question, we are having the IECAT as the exclusion. So based on the criteria entered here, either this variable or this variable, we also have the annotation done for the test code. And it is again clear and understood that if the criteria is entered to this question, which is the inclusion criteria ID, the test code will have a prefix as INCL and then the number of the ID. And since this criteria is inclusion criteria, and we are only capturing the inclusion criteria which are not met, the response to these criteria should be IE in the should be no, and it will be captured in your IEORRES variable. Similarly, for the exclusion criteria, the response should be yes, which indicates that the exclusion criteria are met. So for this scenario, the IEORRES value will be Y, and the IETESTCD will have the prefix of EXCL and then the number of the ID which is mentioned here. There are scenarios where I've seen that the many programmers, what they do is a mistake, that for inclusion exclusion criteria, they populate YY or NN for this type of response variables, which is wrong, because it is clear again and again, I'm repeating here, that for inclusion criteria, the response should be no, and for the exclusion criteria, the response should be Y. Having seen the CRF form, let's move on to our mapping specification. Here again, I have used the SDTM IG Excel format to get the information of my variable name, label, variable order, type, the CDISC control terminology, the rule, and the core variables. So I have already explained in my previous videos from where you can access that file and use it. So I'm not going to repeat that in this video. Now coming to the programming notes, again, the study is same. So the study ID, domain, and uSubject ID logic will be same as we have discussed in our other videos. The domain is IE. The uSubject is the concatenation of the study ID created here, and the subnum. Right now, if you see the raw data set, which is IE raw data set, in this variable, in this data set, the subnum variable is capturing the information of my site ID as well as the subject ID. So to create the uSubject ID, I only need to concatenate the study ID. For the creation of IE sequence, although in programming, while doing the programming for this domain, you will create the IE sequence at the last, and when you are going to do it, you will sort the resultant IE data set based on the study ID, uSubject, and IETESTCD, and generate a unique ID for each variable. From where we are getting this information that we have to sort the data set by study ID, uSubject, and IE test code, this is defined or is evaluated because of the structure of the IE domain, and these variables are categorized as the key variables. And you can see this in your metadata sheet in your SDTM IG itself. If you go to the table, which is 3.2.1, in this, if you scroll down to the I domain, you can see the key variables which are mentioned, that is the study ID, use subject ID, and IETESTCD. These are the key variables which are used to identify the unique records in the IE domain. And if you see the structure of this domain, it is in compliant with the structure. For the next variable, which is the permissible variable in IE domain, that is the IE speed ID, if it is used in your study, you will have this information either captured in your raw data set or will be captured in your annotated in your aCRF form. So if it is done, you can use accordingly. However, in this study, this variable was not needed, so it is being grayed out. Coming to the IETESTCD. So now we have seen that we have captured two informations in our CRF form regarding the inclusion criteria ID not met and the exclusion criteria ID met. So these two information are being captured in two different variables, which is INC LID and the EXE LID in the raw data set. Moving to the raw data set, you can see that we have two variables. One is INC LID and the EXE LID. Here you can see that although in the IE domain or the raw data set, we have the entry for each and every subject which was enrolled in this study, but we are not having the information of the criteria the subject has answered for each and every subject. We are having only the entries for those subjects which were either uh, not meeting any exclusion criteria, and there is um the information about the which criteria the subject has not met, and we are the other thing which we are capturing is the exclusion criteria which the subject has met. So you can see that, for example, here this subject, which is subject 74003001, this subject meet all the inclusion criteria. So we do not have the entry for inclusion criteria, but however, this subject has uh, met the exclusion criteria, which was exclusion criteria number 22. So since this subject was not supposed to meet any of the exclusion criteria, the subject met the exclusion criteria 22. So this subject is a screen failure subject because the subject has met this criteria. So for this subject, we have only one entry, and in that entry, we are giving the information of the criteria which categorizes this subject as a screen failure. And in this subject case, it was an exclusion criteria, so we have the information in this variable. Coming to this variable or this subject, for this subject, which is subject 74002002, this subject had met uh, not met any of the exclusion criteria, so we do not have the exclusion criteria entry. But however, this subject has not met these two inclusion criteria. You can see here the way the inclusion criteria entry is done is that they have populated both more than one criteria, which was in this case not met as separated by a comma. So this subject did not meet the inclusion criteria number 6 and 7, because of which the subject is categorized as a screen failure. So we can see that the information of the criteria which the subject has met or not met, depending whether it's an inclusion criteria or exclusion criteria, is captured in two variables, which is INC LID and the EXE LID. So we will be using these two variables to define our test series and the test categories. So when you are writing the logic for IETEST, in this case, there are two scenarios which we have to take care. First, for the inclusion criteria, we are taking the variable for the inclusion criteria here, which we just saw, that is the INC LID. So if this variable is not missing, then we have to create one record for each inclusion code mentioned in this variable. So right now, it is important to note that we are emphasizing that we have to create one record for each inclusion code mentioned. Why that is? Because as you have seen that in this, instead of creating two different records, one for the inclusion criteria number 06 and another for 07, the way the data was captured in your raw data set, it is having the information of more than one criteria in the same record. So to represent this data in your SDTM format, where we can only have one record per criteria, we have to make sure that we write a program in such a way that we create one record for this criteria and another record for this criteria. So that is the reason here that we are clearly mentioning here that we have to create one record for each inclusion code mentioned in this variable. This is a special case I have seen in this study where they are capturing more than one criteria in the same variable record. However, the normal or the most common way these entries are entered in your raw data set is that they normally create a separate record for each criteria. But however, in this study, since it's a special case, I'm showing you for your understanding as well that this can also happen. So depending on how the data was captured in your study, please make sure you have seen the raw data set before you're mentioning your logic in your specification, and you make an informed decision there that which type of logic you have to mention. If in your study it is same as in this study, you can mention according to this. Otherwise, you can just mention that you can create from that variable, you can take the test CDs. Same is now coming to the exclusion criteria also. For exclusion criteria, if this particular variable is not missing, again, we will create one record for each exclusion criteria mentioned in this variable. So in this way, we have created the IETESTCD. So once we have this information, we can merge the IETESTCD value with our TI dataset based on the IETESTCD, and from TI dataset, we can get the information of our IETEST here. So another point to note here is that in TI dataset, there is no limit on the IETEST value. It will contain the complete text of the criteria. However, when the criteria is more than 200 characters, then we will have to populate only the first 200 characters in the IETEST variable here. The rest of the information, the complete IETEST value or the text value will be shared in your SDRG variable, in the SDRG document in your annexures there. But for these variables, we will only capture the 200 character length of the criteria. So again, another point to note here is there are two conventions here that which 200 characters we have to populate in your IETEST. The most common method which we normally follow is that we populate the first 200 characters of the criteria. However, if your sponsor or your pharmaceutical organization is asking to populate a meaningful text in this IETEST value, then we can definitely ask the sponsor to provide the meaningful text, and we can refer that sheet where they have given this information to populate the meaningful text within the 200 character limit. However, in most of the cases, the sponsor is fine with populating the first 200 characters, and that is the reason it is the most most ways we have seen this type of scenarios happen, but that is not the right or the only way. As per the IG, it is clearly mentioned that we have to mention a meaningful text here. So it is at the discretion of the sponsor what they want the test to be populated, whether the first 200 characters or a meaningful text. In case of meaningful text, they have to provide that text to us and that we can use. Coming to I category, again, it is clear that if the test CD is having the criteria for inclusion, we will populate IECAT. If the test CD is having the criteria created for exclusion, the IECAT will be exclusion. Right now, this variable, which is the subcategory, was not used in my study, so it is grayed out. However, if it is used in your study, you will have this information either captured on your CRF form and we will be annotated, or you will have that information in your raw data set as well. So you can use it from there. Coming to the ORRES variable. So here, as we have discussed, that for the inclusion criterias, we will have a response of N, and for exclusion criterias, we will have the response of Y. So right now in this study, because based on the first question which was asked here, I have the information. So we can populate using that as well, because in this study, I have only one examples here, that the subject is either having an exclusion or is having an inclusion criteria uh, resulting into the subject's failure, screen failure. So because of that, it is possible for me to write for my study that I use the IYN variable, because you can see for the inclusion criterias, we have the response of N, but for exclusion criterias, we have the response of Y. So right now I can use it. But however, if that is not the case in your study, it is better to mention that for the inclusion criteria, the response is no, and the for exclusion criteria, the response is Y. That in that how you can write is, for those type of scenarios, you can mention such like that this. So in this way, you can mention in your code as well. So let me change it this way because it's better, more clear in this format. So in this way, you can mention the IEORRES, and the stress C is the character format, which is because of the finding. I is categorized in the finding domains. So we have the stress C variable also. So it will be same what we have populated as the IEORRES. Coming to the visit variable first, again, in this study, we are having in the raw data set, we are having a variable which is the visnum, which is capturing the information of screening. So I can use this variable to populate my visit num. But however, it is very much clear that inclusion exclusion criteria are always evaluated at the screening phase or the screening visit. So we have this info, but there can be some scenarios or some studies where uh, a reconsent for the recon screening is done in your extension phases. So in that case, it's always better to consider a particular variable where which is capturing the visit information rather than to hard code it to screening. Coming to the visit term, the logic will be same as we have discussed in VS domain, that based on the visit information which we have annotated here, or we have got, we will be mapping it with TV domain for the scheduled visits to get the visit num, and for unscheduled visits, we will use the SV domain based on the visit to get the visit num. Visit dy is a permissible variable, so we do not need this variable to be populated in this study. So this is grayed out. But if you are required to keep this variable visit dy in your study, then this variable can be populated using the visit dy from the TV domain when you are already merging for visit num. The IEDTC variable right now. Normally, this is this can be captured in your CRF form. That is, you can capture a date when the informed consent, the I inclusion exclusion criteria was evaluated. Then you will have a specific raw variables where this variable information is captured, and you can use those variables to populate the date in ISO format. However, in this study, the date was not captured, as you can see here in this form, that nowhere we are capturing the date. So we do not have the date information captured for on the IECRF form. But if I want to populate this date, what I can do is I can, based on the visit information which I have got here, I can merge with the SV dataset and populate the SV start date as my IEDTC variable here. And for IEDY, we have a logic which is same for the other dy variables. That is, we will compare the date with reference start date, which is RF and if the IEDTC is less than or equal to reference start date, then IEDY will be the difference between these two date plus one. And in case the IEDTC is less than the reference start date, then we will not add a plus one. It will be the just the difference between these two dates. So in this way, you can create your mapping specification for IE domain. So in this video, we have discussed the common mistakes which many of the programmers do while identifying the records which needs to be populated in your SDTM IE domain, and the way your IETEST CD category, and the more importantly, the result variable is created. So I hope this video help you to understand what you need to do while creating this domain. Thanks for watching. Let me know in comments if you want me to cover any specific topic or if you have any further doubts.